And I'm going to say what I normally say, which is hello, everyone, and welcome to Refresh. I am always happy to be together, as you can tell, Jill, Joy, Sara, Misasha, because this is a time that we value, right? We're happy to be together. It's a time to connect, to be inspired, to learn something, and ultimately feel just a bit better for this time spent together. And as we know, that's what Generation W is all about. Okay, so I don't know if you've noticed, but last evening was Carly Lloyd's last soccer game. Now, I do hope you all know who Carly Lloyd is, but in the event you don't, know that she has decided to retire after playing 316 games for the United States women's national team. Yeah, there she is. She is awesome. She is the highest scoring midfielder in U.S. history and has won 2 World Cups, 2 gold medals in her 34-year career, which began when she was 5. I had the chance to meet her once at an event. Her humility was really so impressive. This world-class athlete, one of the best players truly in the world. And I was struck by a story she shared just this morning. She shared that she was talking to a coach about 14 years ago. I guess she was in her mid-20s, and he asked her about her aspirations. And she said she wanted to be one of the best players in the world. And what was interesting was this coach's reaction was not positive. Like, he kind of let her know, like, oh, I don't think that's you. And that was enough grist for her personal mill to work hard and consistently strive for the best she can be and to prove herself right. Yes, and in that process, she did prove him wrong. But, you know, it's kind of that thing you put up in your locker room, or if you don't have that locker room, your bulletin board, or you keep in that place in your brain. And, you know, it made me start to reflect on all of the doubting and the underestimation, the predisposed bias that we bring to conversation and relationships all the time, right? The expectations that we have of ourselves and of others. We make these assumptions that at times are rooted in fixed mindsets versus growth mindsets. And when we speak of growth mindsets, you know, these are the ones that thrive on challenge. And as renowned Stanford researcher Carol Dweck has written, that when you begin to understand the fixed and growth mindsets, you'll see exactly how one thing leads to another, how a belief that your qualities are carved in stone, and how that leads to a host of thoughts and actions, and how a belief that your qualities can be cultivated leads to a host of different thoughts and actions, taking you down a very different road. Now, while her research has really focused on our mindset and personal behaviors, you know, as I really thought a lot and read a lot about the conversation we're having today, which, contemplates a new world order, right? A new normal, a better normal, and it's definitely still an ever evolving, quote unquote, normal. What is normal? In meeting Sara Blanchard and Misasha Suzuki Graham and learning about their work, the creators and hosts of an award-winning podcast, Dear White Women, and now the authors of a newly released book, Dear White Women, which, as you can see, I have marked up. And now I'm going to keep marking it up for sure. Let's get uncomfortable talking about racism. It is ever evident that if we want to realize a world where equity is prized, which, by the way, is part of our Generation W mission statement, that we do need to bring a growth mindset to the world around us. It can't be fixed in old assumptions or ways the world was presented to us, which had us fixated on the way the world is, which now we know, you know what, it really isn't. And so we need to be open, you're gonna like this, ladies, to be able to listen, learn, and act, which actually is the organizing construct of this book. A big thank you to Lisa Shallett, our friend and board chair, for making this wonderful introduction and enriching certainly my life. So hello, Sara and Misasha, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me too. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, of course. And so the question is, where shall we start? And why don't we start a little bit about you, why you and how you, right? Now you're two sitting next to each other. I don't know if you're gonna have little hand motions, but all right, Sara, let's start with you.
My name is Sara. I am biracial. I am white and also the daughter of a Japanese immigrant mother. And I am married to a white Canadian guy. I have 2 white presenting daughters, and we live in Denver, Colorado. And Misasha and I met 25 years ago, walking out of a racial identity conversation when we were undergrads at Harvard. And who knew, fast forward 2 decades later plus, that we would be having this platform. We've had this podcast for 2.5 years and now this book. But all of this comes from a place of deep respect, compassion, and ultimately care. This is a very personal conversation to both of us, this idea of identity and racism, and even more so as, our best friendship grew over the years into, the conversations you have as mothers and the care that we have for our children. So I'll let you take it from here.
So yes, my name is Misasha. I am also biracial, Japanese and white, the daughter of a Japanese immigrant father and a white mother. And Sarah, you didn't mention your background, which is...
As a life coach who is a total nerd for positive psychology and the studies of what makes humans thrive. So I love that you mentioned Carol Dweck, because yes, to all of that.
And my background is I've been a practicing litigator for over 15 years, mostly in intellectual property litigation, but focus a lot of my pro bono work on not only voting rights and election protection, but also immigration and the rule of law in other societies that are not our own. And as Sarah mentioned, a lot of this is personal. My husband is Black, and we have two very multiracial boys who are Black, white, and Japanese. And I think that as Sarah mentioned, our conversations evolved from that, meeting and walking out of a racial identity conversation 25 years ago to today. And I would say they took a real turn when we became mothers. And as mothers or as parents, you have these hopes and dreams for your children, but you also have fears, right? You want to protect your children. And one of the biggest fears that I had and have to this day for my boys is that they will walk out of our house one day and not come back. And that's solely based on the color of their skin. And as a parent, as a mother, that is a debilitating fear almost, because you want to do everything you can to protect them. But once they leave this house, they're almost in everyone else's hands as well. So what we also noticed is that we both live in predominantly white communities, and these conversations, these fears that I was having for my kids were not being reflected in the conversations that we were individually having in our own social circles, which were, as biracial women, we're able to float through largely white female social circles. And, we thought, what if we could change that, right? What if we could expand the conversations that were happening in those circles that we were parts of, to be more inclusive, to have conversations about that take us away from what we've always been taught in this country, what has always been the dominant narrative, and make this actually an equitable, society, what America was ostensibly founded on, right? This concept of equitable and justice for all. Mm-hmm. So, we started with the podcast because what did we like to do? We like to talk clearly, and we like to write. So we thought, we'll just get a couple of mics. We'll see this podcast thing. We'll get, 5 friends and family to listen to us, and we'll call it a day. But what we realized about this is this was an incredible platform for us to not only talk about the conversations that we felt were missing, but to have those conversations on a platform with people whose stories have largely not been heard in those circles. And then from there, we thought, what's another way to broaden this narrative? Back to the writing part, we thought, let's write a book, which is, a totally, not, this just chill, easy idea that we had in 2020, which was a chill, easy year. So, but we went with that. And so, this is sort of the next evolution of the message that we have.
Okay, well, there's so much to dig into in here, but it's interesting. You took me on a little side path because you mentioned your children. And many of us are moms, but even those of us who are not, your children are living as you are, as children of your parents' decisions. They have been born as with different identities, And so what are they sharing with you? They're young, right? They're young.
I love the story during Black History Month, what your oldest kiddo said about TV.
So yeah, they're young, but they notice, right? And they have conversations about race and gender and identity of the type that we would have never had growing up. You know, during Black History Month, for example, my older son was watching TV, and he turned and looked at me and said, you know, I noticed that in Black History Month, there's a lot of commercials that have Black people in them that look like me, look like Pops, my husband.
Right.
And after Black History Month, do you think they're still going to have those commercials? You know, and he was 8 at the time. He's there. My boys are now 9 and 7. But you know, this is an elementary school kid who's noticing representation in media, right? And he knows when he's being shown himself in the media, and he knows when he's not. And I think, you know, this goes to our discussions, the discussions we often have about how early kids notice race and color, and how that becomes a differentiating factor. And so these conversations happen a lot, and often through questions. Really, it's often through, you know, noticing or a question.
Right. So I'm gonna and you said, let's get uncomfortable talking about racism. And I think we all find it uncomfortable. We care. We want to be engaged. I think in your forward, Terry Givens talks about the power of storytelling. But if we can't ask questions about each other's stories without feeling that it is an identified microaggression, then how do we bridge the gap? How do we build the trust? Because there is so much fear, especially in this world that we live in, social media, amplification of messages, of being wrong and being called out, even in the pursuit of love and sharing. So how do we make those first steps?
I mean, I think it's first important to recognize that talking about racism is uncomfortable for everybody. It's not just uncomfortable for white people. Talking about identity and where you belong and systems and interrelationships, I mean, it's just uncomfortable. And so when I think it's important to go into it with this understanding that we may not get it right. In fact, we probably won't get it right every single time. But I think it's about that process. It's about the commitment. And for us, one of the things that we find is most important is to start sort of going back and really asking yourself, why do you want to learn this in the first place? Why is this important to you? You know, in our case, it was really stemming from Misasha's fears for her family. And we've been friends for 25 years. I love her family. And so it was really important for me to be able to step foot in this uncomfortable set of conversations, because it was like in my heart, right? Why? It's because I want to be part of helping my friend and helping make the world better for my kids too.
Right.
So I think you have to be able to connect with that why, because that's what propels you forward when you make a mistake. And it keeps you in sort of this posture of humility and learning and curiosity, as opposed to having to be right all the time.
Right. But let's say you don't have a friend, right? I mean, I don't know what the data or the status is about white people and their exposure, communities, neighborhoods to people who are different than them or of color. But your eyes are open, right? You help open our eyes and say, you know, we live in a multiracial world, and that's the strength of America in many, many ways, right? We grew up as a nation of immigrants. I want to know more about that. And so you tell a story in the book, and I use it actually, it's in the Asian, when we talk about Asians. And this one struck me a little bit because I am so curious about people. I want to know who you are. Now, do I ask you what country you're from? Like, you know what I mean? I honestly, I couldn't tell necessarily. Does this make me a bad person? A Filipino person from a Chinese person, from a South Korean person to a Japanese person? I don't have enough exposure to be able to see all of those people different, yet I know culturally they're very different. How do I learn that? How do I ask that? Because sometimes I read that might be a microaggression. And I don't want to be aggressing anybody, right? I want to be sharing with people. And so it's frightening. how do we help in those situations? What's okay?
Do you have an answer?
Well, I think it goes back to, and I think that there's one question that we hear a lot, right? And I think sometimes if it's the first question, it has an othering effect, right? Because if the question is, where are you from?
Right.
The assumption is often that you're not from the US. And we have so many, multiple generation, fifth, sixth generation Asian Americans in this country. So I think where are you from has that effect of, immediately putting the recipient on guard of like, but I'm an American first, because that question isn't often asked to white immigrants, from, let's say, Western Europe, right? The assumption is not that. But I do think that, for example, I have a very unique name, right? And my parents made up my name. So thinking that Japanese would think it's Japanese and Americans would think it's American. And that was a total fail because all Japanese think it's American and all Americans think I'm Eastern European. But
Okay.
but it's a great way to sort of ask that question, being curious without asking me where I'm from. It's like I've heard people say, your name is so unique. What is there a story behind it? And then I get to share, yes, my dad is from Japan, is a Japanese immigrant. And they had this, and I can go into the whole story. And then you hear all about me, but in a way that's not immediately saying I'm not from here, right? With the assumption of that. So I think there are ways to ask the question without asking that where are you from question, because I think for Asians in particular, that has been such an othering question.
That is so, I never thought of it quite that way. And now perhaps we should, right? It's not a question of like, you're not from here, but clearly you have heritage that's come from another part of the globe at some point in your familial history, right? Like I love knowing where people come from, right? My mom is first generation, so I'm just second generation. And it's great to connect with because we all do have that in common. The other thing we have in common is we all feel othered. I don't care who you are. It is in different degrees. I may not understand your degree of othering or what that special experience is, but we all have it. And if we could all tap into that,
Mm-hmm.
right, wouldn't that contribute so much more? And listen, sometimes you were the kid that wore glasses. I didn't wear glasses when I was in school. I don't know about you. You were the other kid. You were that other kid.
But I wonder then if that question is, can you tell me about your family? What's your family's story? Right.
Correct.
And if you're asking that question, I would say like notice about your own questioning. Are you only asking that of people who look Asian or who look Indian or who look a certain way? Are you asking that also of people who look white? And what is the difference? I think it's just a question of noticing, like you said about your son noticing, what's happening on TV. That game of I notice that is a really powerful tool to let us observe our own behavior and patterns and figure out, oh, am I asking that question only of people who look Asian, for example?
True. And we also have to recognize sometimes when we're sitting at a table with all white presenting people, first of all, they might not be. How many times have you sat like it's come out like, oh my gosh, that you hear a story and you wouldn't have known? And sometimes that's also intimidating because then it feels like you're prying.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, there's this thematic, and I'm not dismissing in any way all of these really entrenched systemic, which I'd like to talk more about with you, issues that are buried and not so buried in the way we think and live. I think I shared with you, we had a recent event here for our Jacksonville Public Education Fund, and they had this guy, Eddie Glaude, speak. And his book is Begin Again. It's about James Baldwin. But he talks about the lies we tell ourselves. There are people who think that saying that we lie to ourselves as a nation brings our nation down. You started a podcast to talk about these stories to lift each other up.
Mm-hmm.
Is that working?
I think it depends on how we define success and what we define as working, right? I think one of the things that it has brought up, for example, our platform is a provocative name. Dear White Women, for sure, makes people have feelings, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I think there are reactions where people make assumptions ahead of time. They have no idea if we are white people telling white people you're fine, if we are Black people who are going to tell all the ways that white people are wrong. Like, there's so many assumptions that people make. They call us racist because we name whiteness as a race, when I think probably most people are comfortable saying Asian or Black, but somehow white has been seen by certain people to be this invisible default race, and to name it makes people feel wildly uncomfortable. So we do get those sort of reactions. I don't know, is that success or not? I'm not sure. But then in terms of our mission, which is to really give people those three things we talk about, listen, learn, and act. Let's listen to people's stories so we understand that we are 1 in 7 billion people on this planet, and we all have different experiences and stories. And to learn the history that's not evenly taught in our school system in America. And then to really, most importantly, feel like, hey, look, yes, systemic racism is a gigantic problem, and it's really complicated, and it feels a little bit overwhelming, a lot overwhelming to think about tackling it, but we all have our spheres of influence.
Yes.
Every single one of us can do something about this and move the needle, even starting within our own daily lives. And that's what we feel like we have been successful in reaching people and helping people see that practically we can make change.
Right. And your book, I love the construct of this book. I don't think I can show everybody, but it is listen, learn, and act. So let's talk a little bit about the act, because our audience generally are people who like to do something, right? They like to step in the path of where they can make a difference. So we talked about motivating to action, and maybe the both of you can talk us through some of these steps that will enable us to do some really good positive things in our desire to feel like we live in a more equitable world and we're contributing to it. So Sherry, yeah, there you go.
Ooh, fancy screen.
I know.
Isn't that nice? Look at this. This looks really nice. Okay, so don't be scared to make mistakes in conversation. Easier said than done, but help us through that, because I think we're all fearful with the best of intentions. Make sense?
I think that is, and I speak as someone who grew up with the pressure of wanting to be perfect all the time, right? I wanted to have the perfect answers to the perfect, question, and everything. You can sort of tie it up with a bow and you're done with this issue. And talking about race and racism in this country is the exact opposite, right? It is extremely messy and it is extremely uncomfortable, as we've discussed. So I think if we go into conversation thinking this is going to be, and I find this a lot with my kids, but I also have found it with coworkers or, in school settings or with other parents, going in thinking like, this is going to be this perfect conversation and we're going to have it once and we're all going to be on the same page and we have, solved our racism issue. It's doomed to fail, I think. And it is so hard to get over that hump of saying the wrong thing, right? Because we are so afraid to say the wrong thing and to offend, I think. But what we have really been leaning into is that sometimes we're going to make mistakes, and we're probably going to make a lot of mistakes because we are learning along the way. And a lot of what we're learning and talking about is stuff that we didn't learn in schools. And so I think that changing the mindset from this being a perfect conversation and a one and done type conversation or a checklist type conversation to this is an ongoing conversation that I can have a lot, right? And so I'm going to mess up, probably going to mess up a lot. When I mess up, I'm going to acknowledge that I messed up, and I'm going to learn some more from that point. And then I'm going to have this conversation again and again. And I think that it is really, this growth mindset, right? This idea that this is not a fixed concept, right? And what we have learned in the past might not be actually the truth about how this country works or how we interact with each other, but just the ability to keep coming back to it and keep coming back. And yes, I mean, it's what we tell our kids, right? You learn from your mistakes and, you're going to try and you're going to ask those questions and you're going to come into conversation, even when, you feel a certain way about it, but you just, this is so important that we have to be okay with failing and failing and making those mistakes to eventually succeed.
Right. But I hear you. And let me just say hello to Erin. It is a happy Wednesday. It's so glad you're with us. It's always happy when you're with us. The stakes are so much higher today, right? I saw something that I said to somebody, which was actually, I've said it many, many times, and I would say it again, but chose to be interpreted in a way that they perceived as a microaggression to them. Now, that's fine. They can feel that way or whatever. But then it gets blasted to the world. That's what's scary today. It's like, how do we keep that safe spaces where the people who are trying and the people who are receiving, that the people who are receiving are also trying to understand and walk in the place. Does that, you know what I mean? And I understand what happens over and over again, right? We work in gender equity. As a woman who's worked in male environments my whole life, after a while, you're just exhausted, right? Right? Black women, they're just exhausted. We get that. But in a sense, can we afford to, it's funny because in this book, Baldwin talks about the exhaustion of it all, and yet we must continue to walk. Otherwise, what will change, right?
Absolutely. Even in the work that we do, I've had to ask Misasha, and I think part of the benefit of working with someone you're close with is that we can bring our whole selves to the table. But I think that's all the more reason why we can look at our own strengths and our own personality types and figure out how we want to play a role in this, because there's so many pieces to the puzzle of uprooting systemic racism. And for example, personally, I realized the way my body is built, my body and brain, I'm not like a marcher, right? I don't feel comfortable in those big groups, and I don't like it. And I had conversations with you over the last few years being like, am I doing enough? Am I really doing anything important? All we do is talk. I should be on the front lines and doing these marches, but it feels so wrong. And we had that conversation around, yes, it's important. And it's important that we actually create an authentic way for us to express who we are in these movements, if you will, because it has to be sustainable. The same way that I think, one of the things we remember when you interview people and you want to be able to sit next to that person, right? Because you want to like them in the longer term. It makes the work environment better. If we're going to put ourselves in these uncomfortable situations regularly, you want to at least have it fit your strengths. And so what is that for you, right? For us, it's our voice. Some people, it could be using your bodies. It could be working on legislation. It could be working on voting. There's so many pieces to this puzzle. And so I think it's a lot about figuring out where you want to lean in.
Right. And if we go back to the graphic, number 2 is find I guess you kind of saw find heart ways to ask questions. We got heart ways, right? Find heart-led ways to ask questions, which I think you covered. And the idea of being human, talk a little bit about that. That's so interesting because so often we expect us to be more than human. I don't want to say inhuman because that's not what I mean. That takes on a different context. Is we don't give ourselves a lot of grace, right? Perhaps.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think especially as recovering type A women, right? We want to do so much and we have the energy and we want to help at the end of the day. But I think twofold, but the first thought I had about this idea of being human is that sometimes, especially if whether it's me as a biracial woman or someone who is white or basically someone who hasn't understood the experience of racism, for example, right. We hear people's stories and I don't know, like visually, it's like it's a story out here, right? What we want to do is really relate. And I think people after, for example, like this idea of relating to people's experiences after the horrific murders of the Sandy Hook school children, there was this collective empathy among parents being like, oh, that could have happened to us. And we want to extend that same sort of understanding. So for example, when George Floyd was murdered and he called out for his mom, it wasn't a thing that was happening to some other person, all the moms, not just Black moms, but it's one of those things you want to understand in your heart is happening to another human being. And so if we lead from that place of empathy and we lead from that authentic place of, wow, this is a significantly, horrible thing that is happening to people out there. What can I do human to human, as opposed to labeling it with allyship or some of these other labels that we come to. It's about being good humans to one another.
Well, that right, that is the fundamental, right? That is the fundamental. And this labeling, if you will, thanks, Sherry. It's funny. It's heritage. It's Hispanic Heritage Month, and I have been questioning this label of Hispanics, Latinx. You look at a people who are so culturally differentiated. They share a language, which actually is different dialects, even within a country. And I'm trying to understand, like, okay, that might be easy for us. And somebody actually gave me a good answer on this. But my Puerto Rican friend is much different than my Colombian friend, my Spanish friend, my Guatemalan friend, right? They're all so different. I just came back from Miami, which feels like this melting pot of Latinas. But yet every story is so uniquely different. And so we tend to group like Asians, South Korea, Japanese, and often when you get in the individual communities, there's then tiering in those communities as well, right? Which is also an interesting way to understand people and their experiences. I came from, you talk about India and the caste system. Every community has a caste system, right? I mean, and essentially that's what you're asking us to understand. Throughout the book, I love this question, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you? And we're still like, everybody still is reacting viscerally to that question. What does that mean? Is it are all lives matter? That's a very classic response by some. Is like, what do we do with this? I feel, as you can tell, I feel angst. What do we do with this?
And so in particular, when it comes to Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter and Police Lives Matter, there was a great meme that circulated in social media, and we talk about it here too. For example, imagine a home that's on fire, right? Police and firemen and everyone's showing up to put that house out, the fire out. And imagine a neighbor standing next to it being like, well, what about my house? My house matters too.
Right.
Well, you want the resources to go to the place that is burning. And in this case, there's example after example after example, plus the history of our country that show that we have historically undervalued and devalued people who show up looking Black, right? So we want to respond with that. And then also for the Blue Lives Matter, and I'm saying this now because, with the holidays coming up, we may be sitting next to relatives who say stuff like this. Blue Lives Matter, it's like, well, but they're not really blue, right? Police officers aren't actually blue. They can take off their uniform, put on their street clothes, and they show up in whatever they look like naturally. But Black people can't take off their skin. Asian people can't take off their skin. We can't change our appearance. And so they're not actually great rebuttals. When people say Black Lives Matter and then respond with all lives or blue lives, they're very unparalleled responses. And it's okay to push back and sort of say, I don't know how that, I understand that something about Black Lives Matter is triggering you, but what do you mean when you say Blue Lives Matter? Can you deconstruct that? I think that's a great tool for the holidays or for any time where you hear someone make a racist comment or a joke. Ask them, what do you mean by that? Because they may either be overtly and actually intending to be hurtful, but they may also be like, not have thought about it. And it might be unintentional. And we want to give people an opportunity not to be canceled. We don't believe in this idea of cancel culture. And I know it's fearful, and a lot of people are feeling that divide between like perfection and I do it all alone and I must be hard. But increasingly, we need to be leaning into the reality that we are all interconnected, and we must reach out and talk to one another and get over that discomfort in order to build a stronger sort of community web again.
Right. And let me just say hi, everybody. We are at Refresh, a place we come together to learn together, right? To feel better because we spent this time together. We are with these amazing women, Sara Blanchard and Misasha Suzuki Graham, who have an award-winning podcast and have written this great book. As you can see, I've dug into it deeply, Dear White Women. Two things. I guess, Misasha, I would ask you, you're out with your kids. Do people look at you? Do you feel them looking at you?
Yes. Well, they've asked, I've been asked if I'm the nanny more than once, which is particularly hurtful because I know, and I just come at a place from like, I see a family, and I don't need to define that person's relationship to everyone else. That is my perspective. Probably also growing up biracial, we experienced it a lot, right? Questions over who's your actual parent here. Yes, we get looked at a lot when I'm out with my kids, because I think everyone's trying to think it's human nature to try and fit people into what you understand, right? And because for my entire life, and Sarah's too, I'm sure, it's been, are you white or are you Japanese? It can't really be both a lot of the times. And so they're trying to fit my kids into a box, which is very hard to do. And then they're trying to fit me into that box along with my kids. So I can see the calculations going. But to that earlier point about being human, like I am just trying to, interact with people on a human level. And I'm also surveying to make sure, no one's coming for my kids really. So that's like the dual edged sword of when we go out, right? Because my older son is now at that place where he's moving from, people on the playground saying, oh, he's so cute, to people, sort of looking at him twice because he's getting older, and he's moving out of cute to scary or aggressive or threatening. And that's, has my mother, like Mama Bear, senses up, because I am surveying to see like if
that's heartbreaking. It's a reality. And what I hear so clearly in such a beautiful way is just the reframing. We have taught to see the world as the dominance, because that's the world that's been presented to us our whole lives, right? Now we got to reframe. Our last session, we talked about this, the beauty in is unlearning, right? We need to learn, but we have to unlearn. And that's as powerful. And Becky, I'm just going to reflect what you said, because I think this is important, and I'm glad you shared it. She says, I'm often frustrated by feeling constrained from saying something out of fear. Okay. For example, there was a beautiful little girl, maybe around 3 at the park, who had the most beautiful, fluffy, soft, incredible hair tied up with an adorable, oversized bow. I wanted to tell her mom how beautiful her hair was, but I didn't. I was afraid the mom would think I was racist because I've been told commenting on a Black person's hair could be interpreted as racist. I totally get that. I'm sure you do too. And it what's interesting about that stops us from being human. A human person should be able to comment on another person's beautiful humanness without that kind of concern. But we've been kind of put in these difficult positions, right? So how do we deal with that?
I had two thoughts about that. One was actually, maybe you want to describe this understanding of racist and what that means, because I think for so long we fear this idea of being called racist because you imagine pitchforks, you imagine lynchings, like it's these horrible images of hate and just horrific interactions, right? But I think what you shared from the Beverly Tatum, maybe I'll just run with it, but the Beverly Tatum conversation that you had was this idea of, imagine America is a moving walkway. And racism, we're all moving in the direction of racism because that's the foundation on which this country was built. And so if you're like aggressively running along that way, you could maybe call yourself an aggressive, like active racist, because you're accelerating the process in that direction. But if we understand that everybody in America is on this walkway, by definition, we've grown up in this system. We are all moving in the direction of racism. Even if we turn around, if we're not saying something, right? We're just sort of, I don't like racism. They're moving that way, but I'm going to look the other way, but I'm not doing anything. You're still by default getting pulled along that walkway. In contrast, actively working to be anti-racist is taking steps against the direction of the tide. And it is a slower process. It is active, but we need to use our voices, our bodies, our actions to move away from it. And so all this is to say, I think, I hate admitting it too, but all of us have a little bit of racism in us, right? We are all kind of racist. And I think it's the process of actively questioning our beliefs, questioning our understanding of the history that helps move us and make us make the choice to be anti-racist. We're not racist. We're either moving along that walkway or actively taking steps in the other direction. So within that context, I think there's important to talk about Black hair. And I think, one of the things from what the conversations we've had that I understood is a lot of my Black female friends get comments on how pretty their hair is when they've pressed it straight or when they're wearing a wig, when it looks historically like white hair, like, or when it looks like historically white hair in this standard definition of beauty that we've been spoon fed. And a lot of people don't comment on how beautiful people's hair is when it's curly or natural. And so in some ways, I think feeling free or like, again, noticing when you're commenting on people's hair, are you also commenting on when it looks natural and adorable? And I think that's important for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, I will say it as a mother of Black sons who have had, sort of big poofy hair. I have not minded so much the comments. I do mind when someone comes up and touches without asking me, because that has been very difficult because my son is confused. Like, why is, some woman's hand on my head? Suddenly I don't see any other kids on this playground who are being touched in this way. And yeah, I think that he feels then like he's, again, going back to the other, right? Like he's sort of this exhibit where, it's people feel okay to touch him. And I want to make sure that he knows that that's not okay. But I think that Sarah's points as to, the history, we have had such a history in this country of Black hair and discrimination against natural Black hairstyles, to the point where now we have the Crown Act, which is actually, actively allowing what should have been always the case in the first place, which is you can wear your natural hair in the workplace, in where so many times that has been told to Black people that is not okay. And so I think that it's important to understand that history when you're considering, because people are going to react however they're going to react, but that knowledge of that history is important in informing how you act as well.
Yeah. But I think the question, I think it's important. Let's shine love on these beautiful little children. Like, it's okay to say something. Mm-hmm. I think overall, if you see, it's heartwarming. I would hope that we can share that, because I think it also helps all of our self-esteem if somebody says you're beautiful.
Well,
yeah, that's right. Go ahead, Misasha.
Yeah, no, again, back to the mother point, like, I feel good when my kid is seen, right, in a way that is positive, because there are so many times in his life where he's going to be seen in a negative way. So to me personally, right, this is my personal viewpoint, like I appreciate those comments because it is reinforcing to him in a society that has not always reinforced, his value to him. So.
Right. And you both are beautiful, and you're going to continue to do your podcast, correct? And how and where we can tell everybody where we can find your podcast.
So the show itself, you can listen to anywhere you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, but we also have everything housed on our website at dearwhitewomen.com. So you can find that, plus our brand new merchandise store. You can get the links to the book and some of our latest stuff to update it, but like our the latest work that we're doing on the heels of this book, which is to really get into corporations and organizations and schools to deepen the message that, yes, talking about race and racism is uncomfortable, but it doesn't have to be so scary that you don't do it.
Thank you, Glory. Glory put up your thing. And we are talking, we're hoping, as we're planning for Generation W, to Sara and Misasha, of whether they'll join us for some of our festivities on our April 1st Generation W. I want to thank you both. As in the case of these kind of conversations, you wish there was more. But I've come to learn that in also doing this, sometimes it's very good to leave people wanting more, because it creates the perfect opportunity for the next conversations. I'll tell you, there's a couple, I always take notes. I don't know if you knew that, but I do. And I really was struck. I mean, I think this is true for all of us, but Misasha, when you said, my kids are in everyone else's hands as well. And it really speaks to the systemic imagery of how people of color have been presented historically, and how it's in our brains. And as a mom, right, how much that impacts us. It's not the first time I heard it, but when the way you said that and you continue to say it, it should have us all thinking about how we can unlearn and reframe, right? And I love when you said, Sarah, in talking about conversation, the way to ask is, what is your family story? right? That shows interest and humanness and caring. And it's these little things, right, that really are difference making as we continue to try to convene and work through this. So I just want to thank you both for taking the time. Your time is most precious. On behalf of all of us, I want to thank that. I'd also like to report back to our Generation W community that Nilafar Rahmani, she was with us. By the way, ladies, you would love her as well. She is the first and only woman to ever be a pilot in the Afghani Air Force. She asked for asylum here 7 years ago, ultimately was granted asylum. In the recent upheaval in Afghanistan, her parents were left behind in Kabul. They were definite targets of the Taliban. She was distraught. Her parents were, and her sister and husband and new baby were found. They were brought here to a military base. I have to tell you, I haven't heard from her yet because I didn't want to interrupt, but on Sunday night, they were reunited for the first time in 7 years. It's extraordinary, and I cannot wait to hear and share the details of that. I will tell you that it is daunting to start a new life. Her parents came here with nothing but the clothes on their back, the shoes on their feet. We have helped them launch a GoFundMe page. I think that we could put that up. There you go, help an family start life in America. There's more about her story. We are actively engaged. She is such a member of our family, the Generation W family. She too will be back with this on April 1st, so she can share her ongoing story of life in America, and now her family's life in America. So we hope that if you're inclined, hey, a $5 gift makes a difference. The more on these GoFundMe things, it's just about consistency. Then they will get more exposure. We want her parents need everything. They need everything. They're literally starting from scratch. And Nilafar is still rebuilding her life because she has to go back and get all of her pilot's license so she can fly again. So we just want to show them love and support. In 2 weeks, we'll be back, November 10th. Please mark your calendars. For those of you who are back in a rhythm, yes, we are. We have the so fun, energetic Kay Eisler. Kate is the co-founder of the W Marketplace. It's an economic engine for women and e-commerce platform that supports women-owned businesses, service providers, and gender-balanced companies. She is a veteran of Microsoft. She has 20 years of international executive leadership experience. She is all about challenging the status quo. So she is in good company with Sasha and Misasha and Sara. And it's shopping time, right? Everyone's telling us we have to shop early. So I've asked her to come and bring us some of the goods and services that she's featuring on the W Marketplace, so we can learn about what is in the supply chain as opposed to what's not. Sara and Misasha, thank you again. I don't know, you've kind of lifted my spirits with this conversation, and I was worried about the opposite. So thank you so much for that. We will see you again. Thanks for everyone who's joining us, and we'll see you on November 10th. So then, if we can be of helpful in any way, info@genwnow.com. Thank you, Katie, Glory, Dawn, and of course, our amazing producer, Sherry Levin. Bye, everyone.